Welcome to this Tutor to You sociology topic video on gender differences in education, focusing on gender identities. One of the requirements for A-level sociology is to be able to identify ways in which identity is influenced by social institutions, and on the education specification this is no different. In previous videos we've examined how social class identity is shaped by the education system, and in this video we're going to look at the processes in school that may shape gendered identities. School reinforces and shapes the identities of males and females in a range of different ways. Firstly, the peer group interactions in school. We have seen how peer groups can shape social class identity, but some of the research on peer groups indicates that a pupil's peers may also influence their gender identity as well. A second way schools can shape gender identities is through teacher-pupil interactions, especially interactions with teachers of the same sex. Another way gender identities are shaped by in-school processes are through the acceptance or rejection of the identities that students possess outside of school. Schools have a tendency to reinforce traditional gender roles, and this can cause clashes with some students. A fourth way schools shape gender identity is through expectations and behaviours of the different genders. And a final way is through subject choices and imagery, and how the traditional values of masculine and feminine domains can reinforce what students see as being part of the identity for their gender. Firstly, we'll look at the role of peer groups in the shaping of gender identity. One way in which boys' gender identity is shaped by peer groups is through the promotion of hegemonic masculinity as being the norm. This is seen in research by Willis, Ward and Epstein, with male pupils who do not conform to masculine identities, including the rejection of education, being rejected by the peer group, abused and having their sexuality questioned, all of which can influence a male's gender identity. Similarly, research from the likes of Archer has suggested that female peer groups reinforce gender identities of hyper-heterosexual behaviour, providing status to girls who dress in an ultra-feminine manner, have boyfriends and reject the image of being smart in order to attract males. However, both of these ideas of male and female identities can be criticised by other research. Francis found that girls were increasingly adopting boffin identities that focused on their intelligence over their appearance, whilst in Ward's research some males chose not to conform to the hegemonic masculinity of the boys, but rather chose a more gender-neutral identity in becoming geeks, embracing intelligence and spending leisure time not in stereotypical masculine pursuits, but through comics and gaming. Both of these demonstrate that pupils can actively reject the stereotypical gender identity of some peer groups. In terms of teacher-pupil interactions, Archer's research into how a teacher perceives their pupils is often linked into in-school processes that shape ethnic experiences of education, but it can also be used to explain the way in which students' sexuality and consequently their gender identity is shaped by teachers' interactions. Archer suggested that teachers perceive students in three categories. First, the ideal pupil, heterosexual but not overtly so, usually female and middle class. Pathologised students, the second group, were seen as being asexual and unthreatening, Chinese and Indian male students. This view of those male students as being unthreatening and asexual could shape their gender identity and see a more gender-neutral identity emerge based upon these perceptions. Finally, the demonised pupil, perceived as being overtly heterosexual, usually black or white working class boys, frames a student's gender identity based upon their sexuality, and this demonstrates one way in which teacher interactions, albeit subconsciously, can shape the gender identity of students. Other research by Archer suggests that schools can shape gender identities through rejecting the cultural norms of males and females, particularly those from a working class background. Working class boys will have a distinct habitus, a framework of taste and attributes that forms part of their identity. As schools often reject these values, they will look for status elsewhere. This leads to them obtaining symbolic capital from their peers for the clothes that they wear. In Archer's study, it was branded sportswear. These Nike identities are reinforced by a cycle of the school rejecting their clothing and peers rewarding them, which strengthens the peer group identity. For girls, Archer found that while some conformed to Nike identities, it was more likely that girls would adopt hyper-heterosexual identities for similar reasons to boys. The school's rejection of their habitus only strengthened their resolve to identify with others in the peer group, thus demonstrating how schools can shape gender identity through rejecting the habitus. Expectations of students' behaviours based upon their gender can also influence gender identity. Francis found that identity was reinforced in schools based upon traditional behaviours of males and females and the reactions to these behaviours. Boys who had been socialised into being more active and assertive were allowed to monopolise equipment in classrooms and dominate teacher attention through disruptions such as shouting out answers, making jokes and dominating discussions. Meanwhile, girls' socialisation as being passive and docile was reinforced through teachers ignoring their low-level disruption, such as quiet talking and passing notes. Girls were perceived as invisible, as they did not cause problems within the class, which reinforced stereotypical gender identities of dominant males and submissive females. Furthermore, teachers would react to these behaviours, expecting less from the boys in terms of work, and more from girls as they were less disruptive. The impact of this is to reduce boys' self-efficacy, their confidence, as they are not pushed to go further, while simultaneously increasing pressure on girls to achieve, as a higher level of work is expected of them. The psychological impact of the additional pressure on girls then forms part of their identity. A final way in which gender identity can be shaped within schools is through subject choice and career aspirations. The feminisation of education creates an environment where girls have greater expectations placed upon them to succeed as they are pushed by female teachers. The teachers are perceived as role models by girls, which helps to shape their aspirations for the future, which then forms part of the girl's identity, having higher aspirations. However, schools have traditionally promoted different subjects as being part of the masculine or feminine domain, and for females in the more masculine domain of sport, this results in them being seen as butch or manly, and discourages them from seeing athleticism as being part of their gender identity. For boys, they are actively discouraged from subjects in the feminine domain, such as dance and textiles, by both peer groups and teachers alike. Subject images discourage males from entering female domains, and whilst the opposite is no longer true for females, males will be more likely to pick subjects that are part of the masculine domain in order to retain their status as a real man. Furthermore, the fatalism promoted by anti-school and laddish subcultures discourages boys from trying too hard to achieve, which ultimately leads to failure being associated with the masculine identity. However, in evaluating, we need to realise that school is not the only socialising agent that shapes identity. Identity formation is a fluid process, and many males and females will forge different gender identities over time as norms and values change with major life events, such as employment, getting married, or having children. Identity is not fixed for life, and although school clearly does shape identity in the formative years, it is deterministic to suggest that an individual's understanding of their gender will not change over time. Individuals are shaped by their social class and their ethnicity, as well as their sexuality, their age, their religion, and their health, and therefore the intersectional nature of human beings means that it is difficult to categorically state that schools can shape gender identities. Indeed, it can be argued that changes to gender socialisation in the early years have had a greater impact on the way boys and girls see themselves as having a specific gender identity, albeit that the changes to early socialisation have had a greater impact on females than males. Finally, arguments that education shapes gender identity neglects to look at the influence of other socialising agents, such as the family, media and religion. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on gender and education, looking at gender identities. Thanks for watching.